Okay, now we're going to move to talk about the 19th century, quote, Coulee trade. So China's loss of control over its own seaports as a result of the Opium Wars was the necessary condition for launching the global movement of Chinese Coulee laborers. So coolies describe the Asian people who were shipped by Western colonizers from their homelands to work on profitable sugar, cacao, and cotton plantations. The coolie trade was devised as a replacement for Black and Indigenous laborers. So, for example, in the Sandwich Islands, which are in the Pacific, in Jamaica and Trinidad, which are in the West Indies, and in British Guiana, which is in South America, many enslaved indigenous peoples had died from forced labor or successfully fled into exile. To replace indigenous labor forces, the British colonial empire had transported enslaved Africans into the West Indies to work under brutal plantation conditions. After 1807, when abolitionists in England forced the end of the African slave trade, and later in 1833, when slavery in British colonies in general was banned, the British were faced with a shortage of now African slave labor in the West Indies and in South America. African slave laborers were immediately replaced by Indian coolies shipped from the British colonies in Asia, as well as the labor of recruited, decoyed, or kidnapped Chinese coolies from the defeated post-Opium War China, whose immigration from Opium War treaty ports, as Claire had spoken about with the unequal treaties, had come under British control by the 1840s. Coolies from India and China are forced to work in virtual slave labor conditions on these plantations. And this isn't scripted, but I just want to make a distinction here that coolie labor operated under virtually slave-like labor conditions, but is not directly comparable to chattel slavery. There is a distinction between the type of anti-Blackness that motivates chattel slavery from the types of labor constructs that orchestrated coolie labor. And what's important to know here is the relationship and the evolution from chattel slavery and enslaved indigeneity into coolie laborers, but not to equate the two because there are still distinctions. A notorious example of coolies are the Guano Islands in Peru, where Chinese and Indian peoples who were coolie laborers inhaled chemical guano fumes and died a few months later. Studies have shown that 45 to 70% of coolie, indentured, and contract laborers died before completing their contracts, either in the voyages across the ocean or under the brutal conditions. All of this is to say that colonialism and the use of Asian labor are the main reasons why Asian people are in the Americas. The coolie trade laid the foundation for Asian diasporic presence in the Americas and in the Caribbean to this day. Within a single Chinese family, one son could end up in Cuba or Peru, while the other son could end up in California to quite different fates. The specific character and significance of Asian immigration is complex and conditional on the specific economic and political forces that were at play within empire. Like all oppressive systems, the coolie trade was enabled by some Chinese business elites, while also being staunchly resisted by many other Chinese peoples. One example of this resistance is Young Wing, who was the first Chinese student to graduate from an American university, which was Yale, where Claire and I go to school. And he was a staunch advocate for the termination of the coolie trade in China. In search of labor and land, empire forces Asian migration.
Okay, so we're going to segue into the gold rush now. So San Francisco, as if you're a Chinese American, you speak Chinese, you might know that San Francisco is called Gold Mountain in Chinese. And that is because the free men who embarked from China to participate in the gold rush in America were the ones naming San Francisco. And these men are actually distinct from the coolies who labored in the outposts of the New World's plantations and mines. These Chinese were actually the first non-white foreigners who arrived en masse of their own free will. They were pushed by poverty at home and they were pulled by hopes for wealth, unlike shackled African-American enslaved people who were brought over, stolen from their homelands, or Native Americans who were decimated in their own lands. Yet, like these other non-white people, Chinese immigrants are also prevented from owning property or becoming citizens. Chinese miners tend to do the work white people had abandoned, didn't want, especially the most dangerous jobs. And of course, they were paid less than white people who were doing the same kinds of work. The Chinese were subject to violent attacks and new laws enforced only against them, such as the foreign miners tax and the 1862 police tax. There are also court decisions against the Chinese, such as People versus Hall, which actually casts Chinese people as not only inferior to white people, but also denies them the right to testify against any white person, even somebody who's an accused murderer. So the Chinese were really stuck in the United States without any legal recourse. And because there are now established communities of Chinese people all along the West Coast, white people who perceive the Chinese as economic threats have a location of people to target. There are clear communities of color that do not fit in with the neighboring white surroundings. And there are countless acts of violence against the Chinese people. And also, an interesting thing to note is that in these Chinese communities, the ratio of men to women could be as high as 27-1. And this is because Chinese women didn't customarily immigrate at this time. Most of the men who came over were doing labor that women weren't considered like proper to do. But in these so-called bachelor communities, like a few Chinese men saw a business opportunity to import Chinese women into forced prostitution. So while prostitutes are generally just a general feature of the frontier West in this time period, the existence of Chinese prostitution gives Congress an excuse to pass the Page Law or the Page Act in 1875. This specifically presents Chinese women this specifically prevents Chinese women from entering the United States on grounds that they are sexually immoral and deviant and dangerous to the fabric of American society. So over here, we can see a double patriarchy. It's firstly the oppression of Chinese women by Chinese men who are capitalizing and profiting off their bodies. But it's also the oppression of the imperial state, which used Chinese women's racialized and sexualized bodies to enact a form of social control. And so a lot of Chinese people at this point have been born in like the United States. So there's a whole generation or two of Chinese Americans. And then what happens is that the Chinese are still denied like the basic rights of citizenship. And so they actually forge an alternative route to becoming Americans. They actually relentlessly pursue their rights in the court system. And they turn to the justice system precisely because they understand and believe in the American promise of equality and freedom. Professor Su Cheng Chan is quoted saying, and so we basically extended the promise of the American dream to a much wider range of human beings than the founding fathers may have had in mind. And one particular example is the story of Wong Kim Ark. He was a Chinese American, went to China, and then was denied entry back into his home country of the United States because they did not believe that he was a citizen. So he appealed, and the case goes up to the Supreme Court, and they affirmed that all people born in the United States, including Chinese people, are citizenship. And this sets the stone for birthright citizenship. The Supreme Court realized that if they didn't give birthright citizenship, then every person who was born in the United States, including all the white people, were not citizens. So that is one example. And we just like want to share these examples of Chinese people enacting resistance in these ways, not to like assert that the colonial systems of law and order like offer us any kind of solace, but rather that today's dominant discourse of Chinese and Asian Americans as quiet, non-confrontational, apolitical immigrants has been historically false and something that a history that's been erased by the model minority myth. So, you know, our people are loud. If you ever walked into a dim sum restaurant on Saturday morning, you'd know.
So concluding remarks, obviously collapsing Chinese American history into like 2 15-minute teach-ins is going to be impossible. And this presentation is hiding as much as it reveals about Chinese Americanness, the lack of that identity and its politics. But this we in Claire understand. But growing in our politics is a lifelong pursuit. And creating this teach-ins has been teaching me and Claire so much about ourselves, as well as we hope it has taught you something about yourself as well, about seeing yourself, whether or not you identify as Chinese American, in a way that is under your ownership and your agency and your resistance and not under the dominant narratives that